The scream came from a girl of 14, though no one in the palace dared to say her name aloud that morning. The eunuchs at the marble doors stood rigid, their faces like carved masks. The sound reached them. Faint, trembling, but to step inside would have meant death. Beyond the lattice screens and gold-threaded draperies, a ritual was unfolding that even the empire's most trusted servants were forbidden to witness. To the world outside, Topkapi Palace was a vision of perfection, an empire distilled into stone and silk. It crowned the hills above the Bosphorus like a jeweled diadem, its domes reflecting the first light of day, its courtyards perfumed with rosewater and musk. But inside, in the labyrinth where no map dared go, there existed another kingdom, one ruled by silence, the imperial harem. For centuries, travelers wrote of its beauty, never of its sorrow. Venetian envoys compared its courtyards to gardens of Eden. Persian poets called it the chamber of the moon. None spoke of the children raised behind those golden lattices, daughters of sultans born to command nations, yet forbidden to command their own fates. Every royal birth was greeted by cannon fire and hymns, but beneath the celebration lay a quiet truth. From the moment a princess entered the world, her path was already drawn. Her first breath was not hers. It belonged to the empire. The Ottoman court called it kader, destiny. But for the young women of the bloodline, destiny was merely another word for captivity. A princess's education began before she could even write her own name. Tutors from Persia, Cairo, and Damascus taught her languages, astronomy, music. But these lessons were only the ornaments, the surface of a deeper, more secret curriculum whispered among palace women. It was called terbiye-i sakine, the education of silence. The girls were taught never to question, never to contradict, never to speak of what happened within the walls of the harem. Every gesture had a rule, every glance a consequence. By the age of 12, they learned to bow not only to their fathers, but to the unseen machinery of empire. The palace women who trained them were not cruel by choice. They were survivors of the same system, women whose tenderness had been traded for authority. One such woman, recorded in the memoirs of an Ottoman physician, was known as Aishi Hatun. She spoke softly, but her words were commands. A princess must never tremble before her destiny. The empire does not permit tears. And yet, behind the silken curtains, tears were all that remained. In hidden courtyards, young girls rehearsed ceremonies they did not yet understand, mock processions, ritual greetings, gestures of obedience. Each movement was studied, each breath measured. Even laughter became dangerous, a potential sign of rebellion. What the empire called discipline, these daughters experienced as erasure. One surviving letter, smuggled out by an Italian servant in 1619 and now preserved in the Vienna archives, offers a rare glimpse into their minds. Written in delicate Ottoman script, it reads, "We are taught to speak as if our voices are borrowed. We eat as if the air we breathe must first be granted to us." The author signed only with the symbol of a crescent folded within a tear, a mark historians believe belonged to a princess of Sultan Ahmed's court. Every few years, the harem would fall silent for what the servants called the season of vows. It was the time when royal daughters came of age. The palace celebrated outwardly with feasts and poetry, but behind closed doors, the air turned heavy with dread. Whispers spread among the attendants. Who will be chosen this time? For the daughters of the Sultan, marriage was not a union. It was an assignment, a political transaction sanctified by ritual. At the first light of dawn, the girl chosen for marriage would be led to the chamber of reflection, a windowless room lined with mirrors and embroidered silk. There, she would stand alone, dressed in white, facing her own reflection until the candles burned down. The ritual was meant to purify her spirit before her new life, but it also served another purpose, to remind her that she belonged now to the empire's image, not her own. One court chronicler, writing under a pseudonym, described what followed in veiled language. They teach her stillness as the highest form of virtue, so that when the time of fear comes, she may not betray it with sound. And yet, on that spring morning in 1623, silence broke. The scream that echoed through Topkapi was more than a cry of terror. It was a fracture in the empire's carefully constructed illusion. Guards looked to the ground. Musicians paused mid-note. Somewhere in the palace, a scribe quietly struck out a line in the day's record, removing mention of the disturbance. The empire's perfection could not permit the existence of pain. Later, when the courtiers gathered for prayer, they spoke of the incident as an omen. Some said a spirit had passed through the palace, others swore the sound came from the sea itself. But those who served close to the harem knew the truth. A princess had been taken for preparation. The ritual had begun. And though her name was never written in the chronicles, the echo of that scream would travel through the generations, hidden beneath the layers of silk and secrecy. Every daughter who came after her would hear it, even if only in dreams. For behind every jeweled veil of the Ottoman court lay the same silent contract. Beauty in exchange for submission, power purchased at the price of freedom. By dusk, the corridors of Topkapi returned to order. Incense burned, fountains whispered, and the call to prayer drifted over the Bosphorus like a sigh. But beneath the calm, something in the palace had shifted. A single scream had broken centuries of silence, and though history would try to bury it, the echo endured. The scream behind the silk curtain was only the beginning. They called it terbiye, a word that meant refinement, discipline, and grace. But within the cold chambers of Topkapi's inner sanctum, its meaning darkened. It was no longer a lesson in etiquette, but an art of erasure. Every royal daughter of the House of Osman was to be perfected, purified and silenced before she could be presented to the empire or to a husband chosen by the throne. The women who shaped this transformation were neither noble nor free. They were matrons, shadows trained in obedience so complete they mistook it for devotion. The ritual began when the princess reached the age of 13. Before dawn, her silk bedding was stripped away, her mirrors removed. A eunuch, his eyes fixed to the marble floor, would escort her to the Oda i Terbiye, the chamber of refinement. No one ever described what happened inside, but the palace corridors carried a memory of quiet sobs and the faint smell of burning incense mixed with rosewater, a scent that clung to every girl who entered and none who emerged the same. In the flicker of oil lamps, a circle of matrons in layered veils awaited. At their center stood the Bashlala Hatun, the chief instructor. Her voice was soft, but without mercy. "You are born of the sun," she would say, "but you must learn to dwell in shadow. Only a shadow can serve without being seen." Then began the long sequence. Prayers in languages the girls barely understood, recitations of obedience, and the ritual washing that was less about purity than possession. Each movement was observed, corrected, and perfected. Even tears were disciplined. No sound, no breath, no sign of rebellion. The education of purity lasted weeks, sometimes months. Girls were denied the sound of their own names. Instead, they were addressed by numbers or titles of virtue. Patience, silence, grace. The purpose was not only to teach, but to erase. One chronicler from the 17th century, who later fled the palace in disguise, wrote in a hidden letter, "They are made into living ornaments, trained to smile when they bleed and to kneel when unseen hands pull their strings." Outside the training chambers, life in the imperial harem glittered with deceitful beauty. Musicians played beneath gilded arches, fountains murmured lullabies over the marble courtyards. But beneath that beauty lay a hierarchy of control, a labyrinth of watching eyes. Every gesture of affection between the princesses and their servants was recorded, every whispered secret dissected by the matrons. Trust was not permitted. Even friendship could be reported as rebellion. One story that survived through forbidden archives tells of Princess Miranisa, a daughter of Sultan Ahmed IV. She was said to possess an ungovernable spirit, too curious, too outspoken. During her terbiye, she refused to bow her head during the recitation of submission. The Bashlala ordered her confinement. For 40 days, she was isolated in a room without mirrors. Her meals passed through a slit in the wall. When she was released, witnesses claimed her voice had changed. Softer, slower, each word weighted with fear. Yet she left behind a single piece of embroidery on her pillow, the image of a caged bird, its wings lined with gold thread. What drove such cruelty? Historians suspect a blend of superstition and strategy. The Ottoman court believed that women of royal blood carried a dangerous energy, a mix of intellect, pride, and sensuality that could disrupt divine order if left unchecked. So the terbiye was not merely an act of control, but a sacred duty cloaked in faith. Obedience, they believed, was a shield against chaos. The process blurred the line between ritual and punishment. Some girls were forced to repeat the same movement for hours until their bodies trembled. Others were denied sleep until they could recite entire verses of the Quran without pause. Every lesson carried a message. You are not your own. Those who succeeded in becoming perfect instruments of silence were rewarded with jewels, silks, and praise. Those who resisted simply disappeared from the records. In the Imperial Archives of Vienna, a diplomat once described the Sultan's daughters as creatures of marble, faultless in beauty, soulless in will. Yet even in their stillness, there were signs of quiet defiance. Some smuggled letters through the laundry servants. Others carved symbols of resistance beneath the drawers of their writing desks. A few even wrote poetry, unsigned, hidden in the seams of their garments. One surviving line reads, "They polish the mirror until no face remains." As decades passed, the ritual became an institution. The matrons who enforced it were themselves former victims, repeating what had been done to them, believing it sacred. Fear became tradition, obedience became legacy, and the empire called it virtue. But every ritual hides a breaking point. Whispers began to spread among the eunuchs of one princess who did not break, who spoke forbidden words to her reflection and refused to kneel. The matrons silenced her story. The records sealed her name. Yet in the dim corridors of Topkapi, servants still spoke of a night when the oil lamps flickered for no reason, and a single voice echoed through the chamber walls. I remember who I was. The palace never confirmed the incident. The Bashlala dismissed it as superstition. But the next morning, every mirror in the harem was covered with a veil, and for weeks not a single song was heard from the princess's quarters. History moved on. The ritual endured, and yet, somewhere in the empire's heart, that voice remained, defiant and unrecorded. The empire called it rebellion. Perhaps it was something holier. Remembrance. The palace slept beneath a canopy of gold. Lanterns swayed in the night breeze, their light trembling like frightened stars against the marble walls of Topkapi. The celebration had ended, laughter fading into whispers, silk trains dragging faintly across the courtyard, musicians dismissed one by one until even the sound of the knee fell silent. Only one chamber remained awake, the bridal room of an Ottoman princess. And inside it, history held its breath. The chamber was unlike any other room in the palace. No window faced the Bosporus. The air was perfumed with amber and musk, but heavy, almost suffocating, as if the scent itself was meant to blur the senses. The bed stood upon a platform carved with verses from the Quran, its canopy lined with black tulips embroidered in silver thread. To the untrained eye, it was beauty. To those who knew its design, it was architecture turned into ritual. Every line, every shadow engineered for one purpose, to transform a royal daughter into property. It began with the sound of the eunuch's procession outside the door. 3 knocks, never 4, echoed like the tolling of a distant bell. The eldest matron, the Bashlala Hatun, entered carrying a bowl of milk and a silk cloth. The bride sat motionless, her wrists painted with henna that masked the trembling of her hands. She had been instructed not to speak, not to move, not even to look directly at the man who would soon enter. To do so would break the sacred order, a gesture of defiance punishable by exile or worse. Historians once believed this ceremony was purely symbolic, but fragments from the archives of the Austrian envoy, Hans Ludwig von Kufstein, tell another story. In his report dated 1628, he wrote, "The princess wept as though the world had ended, yet none dared comfort her. Her attendants bowed lower, as if fearing her tears were contagious." These were not the tears of a new bride. They were the tears of a daughter whose life was being signed away under the guise of duty. The ritual was choreographed to the rhythm of power. The Sultan or his chosen groom would enter not as a husband, but as the embodiment of the empire itself. The matrons would recite verses of blessing while discreetly marking the bed's corner with saffron water, a symbol of purity, though its deeper meaning was possession. Once the doors closed, no one was allowed to enter until dawn. The silence outside was law. What happened behind those doors remains obscured by centuries of censorship. Ottoman chroniclers omitted it entirely, and European envoys dared only to hint. Yet the architecture speaks where records fall silent. Narrow slits hidden within the wall, vents disguised as ornamentation, allowed matrons to listen without being seen. Some claim that the chief eunuch would remain stationed outside, counting the hours. Others speak of faint hymns sung in the dark, to remind the princess of her submission to God, to her father, to the empire. In the morning, the ritual concluded with a single act. The princess's bedding, embroidered silk now folded with ceremonial care, was carried away and locked within a chest. This chest was not for her to keep. It was preserved in the palace archives, stamped with the seal of the House of Osman. Her body, her night, her memory, all catalogued, all claimed. The records reveal only one exception. In 1642, the daughter of Sultan Murad IV, known as Aishi Sultan, vanished from official documents a week after her wedding. A Venetian spy later reported rumors that her chamber was found in disarray. Overturned lamps, torn silks, blood on the carved verses of the Quran. The Bashlala was dismissed, the eunuchs reassigned, and Aishi's name erased from every registry. Yet in the private diary of her maid, preserved in the archives of Florence, one line remains. She did not scream, she only whispered, "I am not yours." Was it rebellion, madness, or the collapse of a woman made to bear too much? The empire chose silence. But her defiance became legend within the harem, passed in secret between servant and seamstress, growing with each retelling. By the 18th century, it was said that every time a new princess was wed, her reflection in the mirror trembled for a heartbeat, as though another soul looked back, warning her of the cost of obedience. Centuries later, historians began uncovering fragments, hidden ledgers, coded correspondence, and forbidden poetry written by women of the court. Each piece pointed to the same truth. The wedding night was not a union, but a consecration of submission. The princess did not enter as a bride, but as a vessel of dynastic continuity, her silence the proof of her loyalty. The empire's strength, its myth of order and divine right, was built upon that silence. Today, the archives of Vienna and Istanbul whisper with contradictions, royal decrees beside erased names, blessings beside censored testimonies. And in that contrast lies the empire's greatest hypocrisy. It worshipped beauty, but demanded suffering. It celebrated obedience, but feared a woman's will. In the end, the night that history tried to erase refuses to die. It lingers in the stories of forgotten women, in the creak of the palace floors, in the faint scent of rosewater that still clings to the stones of Topkapi. Every historian who opens those forbidden files hears the same question echoing through time, not from a chronicler, but from a princess who was never allowed to speak. If my silence built your empire, who will speak when it falls? And somewhere in that silence the empire still listens, terrified of the night it thought it had buried forever.